As the crew finished their paperwork, word of what happened on Flight 2317 was already spreading through O'Hare's terminals. By the end of the day, it would become a favorite story among airline staff. Within a week, pilots at airlines across the country would be sharing the tale of how one captain used nothing but skill and science to turn a potentially dangerous situation into a masterclass in peaceful problem-solving. The incident report filed that evening was remarkably simple. Unruly passengers became compliant during flight due to air sickness. All safety protocols were followed. No injuries or damages reported. But the real story of how a group of tough-looking bikers learned a lesson in humility at 30,000 feet would be told and retold in crew lounges for years to come. And somewhere in Chicago that evening, 8 very queasy bikers were probably making a solemn vow to stick to their motorcycles for future travel. After all, as they had learned the hard way, the sky belongs to those who know how to respect it. As Flight 2317 began its descent into Chicago O'Hare International Airport, the atmosphere in the cabin couldn't have been more different from 2 hours earlier. The once rowdy bikers sat quietly in their seats, thoroughly humbled by their experience with turbulence. Most of them were still clutching their air sickness bags like lifelines. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." Tom's voice came over the PA system, as smooth and professional as ever. "We're beginning our final approach into Chicago. Local weather is clear and calm with light winds. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing." The word calm seemed to bring visible relief to the bikers' faces. The leader, whose skull tattoo now seemed at odds with his greenish complexion, had his eyes closed tightly, possibly praying for the flight to end. His fellow gang members weren't doing much better. One was still counting his used air sickness bags, while another had his head buried in his leather jacket. Jenny and Lisa moved through the cabin for final checks, their steps light and confident. As Jenny passed the bikers' rows, she noticed with satisfaction that none of them could even look her in the eye. What a change from the men who, just hours earlier, had tried to intimidate her and her crew. "Seat belts fastened?" she asked them professionally. All she got in response were weak nods and a few groans. The landing was perfectly smooth. Captain Tom made sure of that. After all, there was no need for any more weather patterns. As the plane taxied to the gate, passengers began gathering their belongings, many of them exchanging knowing smiles and glances. What the bikers didn't know was that their adventure wasn't quite over. During the flight, Ray had radioed ahead to inform airport security about the earlier disturbance. 2 air marshals were waiting at the gate, having been briefed about the situation. As the plane came to a stop and the seatbelt sign dinged off, Tom's voice came over the PA system one last time. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chicago O'Hare International Airport. Local time is 2:45 p.m. For those of you in rows 15 through 17, we ask that you remain seated. There are some officials who would like to have a word with you." The bikers, still looking queasy, didn't even have the energy to protest. When the air marshals boarded the plane, the leader just nodded weakly and stood up on shaky legs. His gang followed suit, their earlier bravado completely gone. As other passengers filed past them, there were more than a few satisfied smiles. The young mother who'd been frightened earlier walked by with her head held high. The businessman who'd had coffee spilled on him gave Tom a supple thumbs up as he passed the cockpit door. The elderly couple paused briefly by the cockpit. "Been flying for 40 years, the husband said to Tom, who was now standing at the door. "Never seen anything handled quite so elegantly." His wife nodded in agreement, her eyes twinkling. The air marshals were professional and efficient, escorting the subdued bikers off the plane. No handcuffs were necessary. The fight had quite literally been taken out of them. As they wobbled down the jet bridge, several still clutching air sickness bags, one of the marshals couldn't help but comment to his partner. "They don't look quite as tough as their arrest warrants suggested." After all the passengers had disembarked, the crew gathered in the cabin for their post-flight debrief. There were incident reports to file, of course, but nobody seemed to mind the extra paperwork. "You know," Lisa said, collecting the impressive number of used air sickness bags, "I don't think those guys will be causing trouble on any flights again." Jenny smiled, straightening a row of seats. "I've been flying for 12 years, and I've never seen anyone handle troublemakers quite like that. Not a single raised voice, not one threat, just some creative flying." Tom shrugged modestly. Sometimes the best way to handle bullies is to let them experience the consequences of their own behavior. Physics just helped speed up the process a bit. The transformation in the cabin was something to behold. Gone were the loud voices and threatening gestures that had terrorized passengers earlier. Instead, the mighty bikers had been reduced to a quiet, miserable group, each one fighting their own private battle with motion sickness. The skull-tattooed leader, who had earlier strutted through the cabin like he owned it, was now slumped in his seat, his head resting against the window. His face had taken on a shade of green that perfectly matched the description in the flight attendant's training manual under severe air sickness. "Water?" Jenny asked him with professional courtesy, holding out a small cup. "It might help settle your stomach." He could only manage a weak groan in response, waving away the offer with a shaking hand. His earlier swagger had vanished completely, replaced by what looked suspiciously like a prayer that the plane would stop its gentle dance through the sky. The other passengers were trying their best to hide their amusement. A young woman who had earlier shrunk in fear when the bikers passed now sat confidently, reading her book with a slight smile. The businessman who'd been intimidated into silence was actually humming quietly to himself as he worked on his laptop. Through the cockpit door, Tom and Ray could hear the dramatic change in the cabin's atmosphere. The threatening voices had been replaced by occasional groans and the rustle of air sickness bags being passed around. "Never seen anything quite like this," Ray commented, checking their flight path. They went from Sons of Anarchy to Please Make It Stop in record time. Tom allowed himself a small smile as he made another minor adjustment to their course. The plane responded with a gentle sway that had absolutely no effect on the regular passengers, but sent another wave of discomfort through their troublemakers. One of the bikers, the one with the gray beard who had earlier demanded multiple drinks, was now pressing his call button every few minutes, desperately asking how much longer the turbulence would last. His face had lost all color, and his hands gripped the armrests so tightly his knuckles had turned white. "Just some normal air patterns," Lisa told him with a perfectly straight face. "Nothing to worry about. Would you like another air sickness bag?" The other members of the group weren't faring any better. The one who had spilled coffee on a passenger earlier was now the proud owner of a collection of used air sickness bags. His tough guy demeanor had melted away completely, replaced by a look of pure misery. Even more satisfying was watching them try to maintain their dignity while clearly suffering. One biker attempted to put on a brave face, claiming he'd been through worse storms on his bike. This bold statement was immediately followed by a desperate lunge for a fresh air sickness bag. The elderly couple in row 12, who had watched the whole situation unfold, shared knowing looks. The wife leaned over to her husband and whispered something that made him chuckle. They'd been flying long enough to know this wasn't normal turbulence, this was justice at altitude. Jenny made another pass through the cabin, offering crackers and water to everyone. When she reached the bikers' rows, she noticed their leader was no longer making eye contact. In fact, he seemed very interested in studying the pattern on his air sickness bag. "Feeling any better?" she asked, her voice professional, but with just a hint of satisfaction. His only response was to reach for another bag, his threatening presence from earlier now completely deflated. His gang members, spread across 3 rows, were all in similar states of distress. The only sounds coming from their section were occasional groans and the rustle of paper bags. A mother with 2 young children, who had earlier asked to be moved away from the group, was now calmly helping her kids with their coloring books. The normal hum of conversation had returned to the cabin, though notably absent were the loud, aggressive voices that had dominated earlier. Through the flight deck's camera feed, Tom could see his plan had achieved its desired effect. The troublemakers had been neutralized without a single confrontation, without calling in air marshals, without any violence at all. Just the clever application of physics and a pilot's deep understanding of how to make an airplane dance. "You know," Ray said quietly, "I think we just witnessed the most elegant handling of unruly passengers in aviation history." Tom nodded, making one final gentle adjustment to their flight path. "Sometimes," he replied, "the best way to handle bullies is to let them defeat themselves. Though I have to admit, a little help from Sir Isaac Newton never hurts." As Tom prepared for one final gentle roll, he couldn't help but reflect on the irony of the situation. These men, who probably prided themselves on their toughness on the ground, were being completely undone by movements so subtle they barely registered on the plane's instruments. Sometimes the best lessons in humility came from unexpected places, like the supple dance of an airplane through perfectly clear skies. The next 20 minutes aboard Flight 2317 turned into a masterclass in the subtle art of aeronautical karma. Captain Tom's carefully planned sequence of movements continued, each adjustment building on the last like a well-conducted symphony of discomfort for those who'd been misbehaving. "How are our friends doing back there?" Tom asked through the intercom, his voice low enough that only the crew could hear. Jenny's response came with a barely suppressed chuckle. "Remember that tough guy with the skull tattoo? He's turning greener than a rookie pilot in a spin cycle. They've gone through half our airsickness bag supply already." Tom nodded, making another gentle adjustment to their flight path. The beauty of his strategy lay in its simplicity. Each movement was perfectly legal, completely safe, and absolutely miserable for anyone who'd been drinking or moving around the cabin. Through the flight deck's camera feed, they could see the transformation taking place. The once rowdy bikers were now slumped in their seats, all thoughts of intimidation forgotten. The leader, who had earlier towered over everyone, was now curled over his airsickness bag, his fearsome appearance somewhat diminished by his current state. "You know what's really interesting about flight dynamics?" Ray commented, monitoring their instruments. "It's all about rhythm and timing. Like right now, we're about to hit that pocket of perfectly normal air that feels just a bit wobblier than usual." As if on cue, Tom initiated another sequence. First, a slight climb that lasted 3 seconds longer than passengers might expect. Then, a gentle bank to the right that somehow made the airplane feel like it was swaying ever so slightly. Nothing dramatic, nothing dangerous, just enough to keep their troublemakers thoroughly uncomfortable. The other passengers had caught on by now. A businessman in first class, who'd watched the earlier harassment with concern, was trying to hide his smile behind his laptop. An elderly couple exchanged knowing looks, the wife patting her husband's hand as they watched justice being served at 30,000 feet. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tom's voice came over the PA system, smooth as silk, "we're continuing to experience some light chop. Please remain in your seats with your seat belts fastened. Our flight attendants will resume service once conditions improve." The word improve took on a whole new meaning as Tom implemented the next phase of his plan. He'd learned this particular technique during a training mission over the Nevada desert. How to use the natural air currents to create a gentle rocking motion that was perfectly safe but increasingly uncomfortable for anyone feeling less than stellar. Jenny's voice came through the intercom again. "The guy with the gray beard just asked me if we're flying through a hurricane. I told him it's just a bit of normal turbulence." He didn't look convinced, especially when he had to grout for his 4th airsickness bag. The cabin had transformed from a scene of intimidation to one of poetic justice. The bikers who had earlier swaggered through the aisles like they owned the plane were now clinging to their armrests. Their faces had taken on various shades of pale green, and their earlier bravado had evaporated like clouds in a jet stream. "Think they've had enough?" Ray asked, watching as another biker fumbled desperately with his airsickness bag. Tom checked their location on the navigation display. "Almost. Let's give them one more sequence, just to make sure the lesson sticks." He initiated what pilots sometimes called the gentle giant, a series of supple movements that made the plane feel like it was swaying in a lazy figure-8 pattern. Nothing showed up on their instruments as unusual, but the effect on their unsettled passengers was remarkable. Through it all, most of the regular passengers were experiencing nothing worse than mild discomfort. Some had even dozed off, the movements too subtle to disturb those who weren't already queasy. But for their troublemakers, each minute felt like an eternity. Lisa, the flight attendant they'd intimidated earlier, now walked past their rows with professional concern, offering fresh airsickness bags with a smile that contained just a hint of satisfaction. "Can I get you gentlemen some water? Or perhaps some crackers? They sometimes help with motion sensitivity." The only responses she received were groans and weak waves of dismissal, a far cry from their earlier aggressive behavior. The mighty had fallen, brought low not by force or confrontation, but by the simple laws of physics and one pilot's ingenious application of them. Tom's plan was working perfectly. No confrontation, no escalation, just the clever use of his expertise and the natural laws of physics. As he initiated another gentle roll, he knew that sometimes the best way to handle bullies wasn't to meet force with force, but to let them defeat themselves. "Denver Control," he radioed, his voice still perfectly professional. "Those weather patterns are quite interesting. We may need another 15 minutes to navigate through them properly." The controller's response came back with what sounded suspiciously like amusement. "Roger that, Pacific 2317. Take all the time you need." Captain Tom's fingers moved across the control panel with practiced precision as he formulated his plan. Most pilots would have immediately diverted to the nearest airport, the standard protocol for unruly passengers. But Tom knew that another hour of this behavior could put everyone at risk. They needed a solution now, not later. "Denver Control, this is Pacific Airways 2317. He spoke into his headset, his voice calm and professional, requesting clearance for altitude adjustment and route modification. "We're picking up some interesting weather patterns." Ray shot him a knowing look. The weather radar showed nothing but clear skies, and they both knew it. The controller's voice crackled back through their headsets. "Pacific 2317, weather appears clear in your sector. Please clarify your request." Tom leaned closer to his mic. "Denver, we're seeing some potential turbulence patterns. Requesting flexibility for the next 30 minutes to navigate around them." There was a pause, and Tom could almost picture the controller studying their flight path. "Copy that, Pacific 2317. You're cleared for pilot's discretion on altitude and heading within your corridor. Keep us updated." A small smile crossed Tom's face as he turned to Ray. "Remember that training exercise back in '98? The one that had half the squadron reaching for their airsickness bags?" Ray's eyes widened with recognition. "The gentle giant maneuver?" "Tom, that's brilliant and a little evil." He chuckled softly, already adjusting his own controls to support what was coming. The plane continued its steady cruise as Tom began making subtle adjustments. Nothing dramatic, that wasn't the point. Just a slight adjustment to the pitch, barely noticeable at first. The kind of movement that wouldn't bother seasoned flyers, but would slowly begin to affect anyone who'd been drinking. Through the cockpit door, they could still hear the bikers' loud voices. The leader was saying something about showing them who's boss. Tom made another minor adjustment, this time a gentle roll that lasted just a few seconds longer than usual. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tom's voice came over the intercom, smooth and professional. "This is your captain speaking. We're entering an area of light turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. Flight attendants, please suspend service and secure the cabin." The announcement was standard enough, but Tom knew what was coming. He'd learned this technique during his military days, how to use the plane's natural movements to create discomfort without ever putting anyone at risk. It was all about timing, precision, and patience. He began a series of subtle maneuvers, a slight pitch-up followed by a gentle roll, then a slow return to level flight, only to begin another sequence moments later. Each movement was well within normal flight parameters, but their combination and timing was carefully calculated. The first sign that it was working came about 5 minutes later. The loud voices from the back had quieted somewhat, replaced by occasional groans. Through the intercom, Jenny reported that the bikers were beginning to look distinctly uncomfortable. "Those drinks they smuggled in? Not sitting so well now," she whispered, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. Tom continued his carefully choreographed flight pattern. A touch right, then left, another gentle climb followed by a barely perceptible descent. To most passengers, it felt like nothing more than mild turbulence. But for anyone who'd been drinking heavily or moving around the cabin, it was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. Ray monitored their instruments carefully, ensuring every movement stayed well within safety parameters. "You know," he said quietly, "in all my years of flying, I've never seen anyone handle troublemakers quite like this." Through the cabin cameras, they could see the changes taking place. The skull-tattooed leader, who had been so intimidating earlier, was now gripping his armrests, his face taking on a distinctly greenish tinge. His fellow bikers weren't faring much better. The one who had grabbed Jenny was now frantically searching for his airsickness bag. "Looks like our friends are starting to appreciate the finer points of aviation physics," Tom remarked dryly, making another subtle adjustment to their flight path. The other passengers, while experiencing nothing more than mild discomfort, had begun to realize what was happening. Several were hiding smiles behind their magazines or hands, watching as the formerly rowdy bikers grew quieter and queasier by the minute. "Ray," he said calmly, "call ATC and tell them we need to make some adjustments for weather patterns. And maybe get those air sickness bags ready. I have a feeling our friends in the back are going to need them." The breaking point came faster than anyone expected. The tension in the cabin had been building like storm clouds on the horizon, and now the storm was about to break. Jenny, who'd handled everything from medical emergencies to panic attacks in her 12 years as a flight attendant, knew they were reaching a critical moment. She just finished helping the young man with his coffee-stained clothes when she heard more commotion from the back of the plane. This time, it was Lisa, the newest flight attendant on their crew, trying to handle a situation that was quickly spinning out of control. "Sir, please, you need to stay in your seat." Lisa's voice wavered slightly as she addressed the biker with the skull tattoo. He'd been pacing the aisle again, deliberately bumping into seated passengers' shoulders as he walked past. "I need to stretch my legs," he growled, towering over her. "You gonna stop me?" His breath reeked of alcohol, and his eyes had a glazed, dangerous look that made Lisa take an involuntary step back. Jenny immediately moved toward them, her experienced eyes taking in the situation. Other passengers were watching with held breath. A grandmother clutching her knitting needles, a college student pretending to be absorbed in his textbook while recording everything on his phone, a businessman nervously loosening his tie. "Sir," Jenny stepped in, her voice firm but professional. "FAA regulations require all passengers to remain seated when the seatbelt sign is illuminated. It's for your safety." The leader turned his attention to Jenny, his lips curling into an unpleasant smile. Well, looks like we've got ourselves a real professional here, boys." His friends laughed on cue, the sound echoing unnaturally in the pressurized cabin. That's when things went from bad to worse. As Jenny reached for the intercom phone to update the cockpit, one of the other bikers grabbed her wrist. The serving cart she'd been restocking rattled, sending cups and napkins cascading to the floor. The sudden clatter made several passengers gasp. "We don't like being told what to do," the biker said, his grip tightening. Jenny winced but kept her composure, years of training kicking in. In the cockpit, Captain Tom heard the commotion through the door. More importantly, he heard something in Jenny's quick, sharp breath over the intercom that set off every alarm bell in his head. 15 years of commercial flying combined with his Air Force experience told him this situation had just crossed a line. "Ray," he said quietly to his co-pilot, "remember that training exercise we did last month? The one about unusual flight patterns in emergency situations." Ray nodded, catching the look in Tom's eye. He'd worked with Tom long enough to know that look. It was the same one he'd seen when they'd handled that engine warning over the Rockies last year. Tom had a plan. "Get me weather patterns for the next 100 miles. Tom requested, his mind already working through the physics and angles. "And contact ATC. Tell them we need a little flexibility in our flight path." Back in the cabin, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The biker group had formed a loose circle around Jenny and Lisa, their intimidating presence creating a wall that trapped the flight attendants against the galley wall. Other passengers watched helplessly, some pressing their flight attendant call buttons in silent protest, others whispering urgently to their seatmates. "Maybe we should teach you ladies how we handle people who try to boss us around," the skull-tattooed leader said, cracking his knuckles for effect. His game members chuckled, the sound mixing with the constant drone of the engines. Jenny managed to press the emergency signal to the cockpit, 3 short buzzes followed by a long one. It was a code they rarely used, but every crew member knew what it meant. Immediate intervention needed. In the cockpit, Tom heard the signal and his jaw set firmly. He'd seen enough combat situations to know when decisive action was needed. But this wasn't a battlefield, it was a commercial airplane full of innocent passengers. He couldn't just dive and roll like he used to in his F-16. No, this situation needed something more subtle, something that would solve the problem without endangering anyone, something that would use these troublemakers' own swagger against them. As he reached for the controls, Tom's mind flashed back to his Air Force days, specifically to a training exercise that had made half his squadron airsick. A small, grim smile crossed his face as he began to put his plan into action. These bikers thought they were tough on the ground, but they were about to discover that at 30,000 feet, the pilot makes the rules. The first 2 hours of Flight 2317 passed with growing tension, like a rubber band being slowly stretched to its limit. At first, everything seemed manageable. The takeoff had been smooth, and the plane had reached its cruising altitude without any issues. But as the morning wore on, the situation in the cabin began to unravel. It started with little things. The bikers kept pressing their call buttons, demanding drinks before the beverage service had even begun. Jenny and her crew tried their best to maintain order, politely explaining the service schedule, but the group wasn't interested in following normal flight procedures. "Come on, sweetheart, we're thirsty back here," one of them called out, his voice carrying through the cabin. Other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some putting on headphones to block out the growing noise. By the time the drink cart finally reached row 15, the group had grown more demanding. They ordered multiple drinks each, speaking over each other and ignoring the flight attendants' attempts to maintain some semblance of order. The skull-tattooed leader sat silently, watching it all unfold with an unsettling smirk. "Sir, I apologize, but we can only serve one alcoholic beverage per passenger at a time," Jenny explained patiently to a biker with a thick gray beard who had requested 4 whiskeys. "Do you know who we are?" he growled, leaning into the aisle. "We're the road warriors, and we don't follow your little rules." The tension spike was immediate. A businessman 3 rows ahead pretended to be deeply absorbed in his laptop screen, while an elderly couple exchanged worried glances. A young woman clutched her purse closer, trying to make herself invisible in her window seat. The situation worsened after their second round of drinks. The seatbelt sign was on due to expected turbulence, but the bikers ignored it completely. They began moving between rows, talking loudly about their latest rally and making inappropriate comments to female passengers. Their voices grew louder, their laughter more aggressive. The leader, who had been quietly observing, finally stood up. He was tall enough that his head nearly touched the overhead bins, and his presence seemed to fill the entire aisle. He began walking up and down the cabin, making a show of sizing up other passengers. When a flight attendant politely asked him to return to his seat, he just stared at her until she stepped back. In the cockpit, Captain Tom and Ray were receiving regular updates about the deteriorating situation. Through the cockpit door, they could hear the rising commotion. Tom's jaw tightened as he listened to another report from Jenny through the intercom. "They're getting more aggressive," she whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. "They've already gone through the drink limit, and they smuggled their own alcohol on board. We've found empty mini bottles in the bathroom." The final straw came when one of the bikers, stumbling back from the bathroom, accidentally knocked over a young man's coffee cup, spilling the hot liquid across his lap. Instead of apologizing, the biker laughed, and his friends joined in. The young man sat there, coffee soaking through his jeans, too intimidated to say anything. Jenny tried to intervene, offering napkins and assistance to the coffee-splattered passenger. As she bent down to help clean up, the biker with the gray beard made a grab for her arm, missing but making his intentions clear. The other passengers watched in stunned silence, fear and anger mixing in equal measure. In the cockpit, Tom heard the commotion and Jenny's sharp intake of breath through the intercom. His hand tightened on the controls as Ray shot him a concerned look. They both knew this had gone too far. Something had to be done before the situation escalated further. "Looks like we need to make some decisions," Ray said quietly, checking their position over Kansas. Tom nodded, his mind already racing through options. He hadn't spent those years in the Air Force for nothing, and while this wasn't a combat situation, it required the same kind of strategic thinking. As he reached for the radio to contact air traffic control, a plan was already forming in his mind. The bikers had no idea that their next few minutes of rowdy behavior would be their last one standing. Captain Tom Wilson was about to teach them a lesson they'd never forget, and he wouldn't have to leave his seat to do it. It was just another busy morning at Los Angeles International Airport. The sun had barely peeked over the horizon when Captain Tom Wilson walked through the terminal, his polished shoes clicking against the floor as he made his way to Gate B7. After 15 years of flying commercial planes, he had his routine down to a science. A quick coffee from his favorite airport cafe, a thorough weather check, and then straight to the pre-flight checklist. As he settled into the cockpit of the Boeing 737, Tom couldn't shake off a strange feeling about today's flight to Chicago. Maybe it was the unusual weather pattern developing over the Midwest, or perhaps it was just that extra shot of espresso in his morning coffee. Either way, something felt different about Flight 2317. The morning proceeded normally at first. Tom went through his usual pre-flight checks, working in perfect sync with his co-pilot Ray. They'd flown together for 3 years now, and their silent coordination showed their experienced partnership. The fuel levels were perfect, the navigation systems were running smoothly, and all maintenance checks had come back clear. Then came the commotion. The first sign was the growing murmur from the boarding area. Tom glanced out the cockpit window and spotted them, a group of 8 bikers, decked out in leather jackets covered in patches and badges. They weren't your typical morning flight passengers, that's for sure. Some were sporting long beards, while others had arms covered in colorful tattoos. Their loud laughter echoed through the jet bridge as they made their way onto the plane. "Well, that's something you don't see every day," Ray remarked, raising an eyebrow as he adjusted his headset. The flight attendants were already showing signs of concern. Jenny, the head flight attendant with 20 years of experience, poked her head into the cockpit. Her usually cheerful face carried a hint of worry. "Just wanted to give you a heads up, Captain," she whispered. "Our new friends in rows 15 through 17 seem to have already started their party. They're being rather festive." Tom nodded, understanding the subtle warning in her voice. Through the open cockpit door, he could hear their boisterous voices growing louder, punctuated by occasional bursts of rough laughter. Other passengers were already requesting seat changes, creating a logistical puzzle for the cabin crew. As the final preparations for takeoff continued, Tom couldn't help but notice the increasingly tense atmosphere in the cabin. The bikers were getting more comfortable, too comfortable. One of them was already arguing about the overhead bin space, while another kept demanding proper drinks before takeoff. The boarding process, which usually took about 20 minutes, stretched to 35 as the flight attendants carefully managed the growing tension. Regular business travelers clutched their laptops closer, and a young mother in row 12 was quietly asking to be moved further forward with her toddler. What caught Tom's attention most was their leader, a tall, burly man with a prominent skull tattoo covering his neck. He carried himself with an air of authority that the others clearly respected, or perhaps feared. While his companions were loud and boisterous, he maintained a calculating silence, only speaking in short, commanding bursts to his group. Through his years of flying, Tom had dealt with all sorts of passengers, crying babies, anxious flyers, entitled business people, and even the occasional celebrity. But something about this group set off his internal alarm bells. As a former Air Force pilot, he'd learned to trust these instincts. "Let's keep a closer eye on this one, Ray," Tom said quietly as he began the final pre-takeoff checks. "Something tells me we might need to stay extra alert today." Ray nodded in agreement, his experienced eyes also noting the unusual dynamics developing in the cabin. As they prepared for pushback from the gate, both pilots could hear the growing noise from the back of the plane. The morning sun now fully illuminated the cabin, but the bright Los Angeles day seemed to carry a shadow of uncertainty about what this flight might bring. Little did anyone know that this routine morning flight was about to become one of the most memorable in Pacific Airways history, and Captain Tom Wilson would soon need to draw upon skills he hadn't used since his military days. As the engines roared to life and the plane began its taxi to the runway, the real story was just about to unfold.